Well, welcome. You guys will note that we're still in the time period 1750 through 1900, although this one we're going to take it up through about 1910, maybe even up as much as 1920. Remember these times when we're doing periodization, we're talking about time periods. Please remember that these dates don't always end in a real clean cut way. Ideally, we talk about this time period as 1750 through 1900. However, it is important to realize that that when Europe, it's really kind of 1914, and Latin America, it's kind of through 1920, those kind of things. So, what's going on during this time period? Well, the big thing early in this time period is the creation of new Latin American nations. Latin America gets its name because the two groups of people who settle there are the Spanish and the Portuguese, both of whom speak Romance languages, which derive from, yep, that's right, Latin. So it gets the name Latin America, which is essentially everything south of the Rio Grande on the Western Hemisphere. So North and South America. So one of the problems we're going to look at during this time period is, first off, we're going to look at the creation of nations. Then we're going to look at what the role of religion is within these nations. Are they going to be theocracies? Thea meaning God, ocracy having to do with power. Okay, so theocracy means God power, God government. And what type of society are we going to have? We're going to have an egalitarian society, or we're going to have what we had before the independence movements, a very aristocratic, very stratified society, very stratified on race and class. Race played a huge role in Latin America. What's the nature of the economy going to be? This is the 1800s. We're starting to see some industrialization around the world. Are we going to see industrialization in Latin America? Or are they going to remain export crop places? And it's more export crops, although there's a little bit of industrialization. Not a lot, but a little. And what form of government are they going to be? Are they going to be republics where people vote on their leaders? Are they going to be monarchies, which is the route Brazil goes? And we'll talk about that. Every other Latin American country, for the most part, goes republic. However, please understand these are not republics in the sense that average common people are voting and helping make the decisions. Instead, these are republics that are dominated by wealthy landholders. Okay? And they always feel threatened by foreign governments from Europe, Spain, Portugal, England, France even, feel threatened by their neighbors, particularly the United States. We get very involved in Latin America at the end of this time period, and we're going to be down there a lot during the 20th century, during the 1900s. And that there's threats from each other, struggles between the Latin American countries themselves. All right, so Latin America gains its independence, but it does so after the United States. The United States gained its independence, remember, 1776, and by 1789, we've got a constitution. So why didn't Latin America go earlier? Why does it wait almost 40 to 50 years after the United States? And it really comes down to class differences and racial differences. For instance, the Creoles, you remember them, they're descendants of Spanish or Portuguese that are born in the Americas. So they're European descendants born in the Americas. They're afraid to lead a revolt and kick out the Spanish or the Portuguese and their soldiers. That's what they want to keep around, because what they're afraid of is they're afraid that if the other groups, if remember the groups below them, the mixed race groups, the slaves and the Native Americans, ever realize their power, they can overthrow the Creoles, kick them out, and upset them. In fact, there was a Native American uprising by a guy by the name of his real name was Tupac, in Western South America. And he led a Native American uprising, and it scared the heck out of the Creoles and the Peninsulares because they thought if these Native Americans here in the western part of South America ever get their act together, they're in trouble. All right, so what kind of things encouraged this political change? Well, one that they loved was the American Revolution of 1776. Why did they love it so much? The Creoles loved it because it was not really a revolution. Now, normally we think of a revolution like the French Revolution, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second, and we've talked about earlier. That really upset things. If you remember, they closed the Catholic Church for a while. They do away with kings. In fact, there'll be beheadings of aristocrats. All the feudal privileges of the wealthy landowners are taken away during the French Revolution. This really upsets the social structure. In the American Revolution, we've got before independence, after independence. Were there slaves before independence? Yes. Were there slaves after independence? Yes. Were there poor tenant farm? If you were a poor tenant farmer before the revolution, after the revolution, you're a poor tenant farmer. If you're an aristocrat, a wealthy landowner, or a wealthy merchant before the revolution, after the revolution, you're a wealthy landowner or a wealthy merchant. The French Revolution, I'm there. Now that inspired them, but it was an example to be avoided because the Creoles didn't want to lose their position. And so regicide, having to do with the killing of kings, ICIDE means to kill, reg having like royal, regal, kingly. So it's the killing of kings. There's a rejection of the church under the radical phase of the French Revolution. And there's, the top is brought down and the bottom's brought up a little bit during the French Revolution. And that just bothers the Creoles. So they hesitate. Another thing that inspires them, but also scares them half to death, is the Haitian Revolution, 1791. Why? Well, what happens is Haiti is a French colony. They had gotten it during the 7 Years' War, during the treaty at the end of the 7 Years' War, and they got it for its sugar production. So it had and if you remember anything from sugar production takes a lot of slaves because it's a high death rate. In fact, at one point, the estimate was that if a slave is brought from Africa, a male slave, and put to work on a sugar plantation, his life expectancy after he started working on the sugar plantation was 2 to 3 years. So it's pretty rough. So there are a lot of African slaves, and they get together under a guy by the name of Toussaint Louverture. You see his name there. And they are going to overthrow the French. Not only the French, but the Spanish will send soldiers there, and the English will send soldiers there. And the slaves are able to hold them all off and establish their own country. Scared the heck out of the United States, scared the heck out of all the island places and any of the places that had slaves. I mean, you got to think about it. A lot of these islands are over 90% slaves. And the fear, they constantly live in fear, the slave holders, is if the slaves ever realize the strength in their numbers, they're in trouble. Also, there's a confused Iberian political situation going on with Spain and Portugal. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, remember Iberian Peninsula, it's got Spain and Portugal on it. So what confuses it is these revolutions happen between 1812 and 1820. And what's going on at the beginning of this time period, about 1812? That's right, it's the Napoleonic Wars. So Napoleon's been running around Europe trying to conquer Europe. He doesn't conquer Spain because Spain's an ally of his. But Portugal's not an ally. And if you look at a map, to get to Portugal, he's got to go through Spain. So he asked the King of Spain, hey, can I come through? The King of Spain says, sure. He says, I'm not invading you. I'm just taking my army on the way to Portugal. Well, the Portuguese realize that he's coming, and they know they cannot stand up to Napoleon's armies. Napoleon's armies and the French armies were the best armies in Europe in the early 1800s. French were really good soldiers and fighters. So the Portuguese king, royal family, top government officials, somewhere 10 to 20,000 of them, get on ships and go to Brazil. They go to Rio, which, by the way, we'll talk about later. They really like Rio. So they surrender. So he marches through Portugal, puts one of his own guys in charge. On the way back through Spain, he says to the Spanish royalty, you're an independent country. I'm not telling you that you're part of my empire, but I'm going to put my brother in charge. Well, what do the colonies think of this? Do they see Napoleon's brother as a legitimate ruler? No. In fact, what they'll say is, while Napoleon's brother's on the throne, we don't have to listen to what Spain tells us. We're independent because he's not legitimate. And that independence they go through for a while there is going to feel really good to them. And when Spain tries to push themselves back on them, they reject it. It's going to help to lead to the independence movements. Spanish-American independence struggles. So what was the order of independence in South America? Well, actually, the breakaway goes in reverse order of the settling. If you remember, the first places to get settled are the islands. Then they move to the mainland. But in independence, it's the mainland countries who break free first, and the islands gain their independence last. And it kind of makes sense to us. Like I said, take an island like Jamaica, which had over 90% of the people were slaves or descendants of slaves. And there's about 5 to 8% of the population is British descendants. What do you think those British slaveholders lived in fear of? That's right, a slave revolution. So they want soldiers to hang around. So a lot of the islands want the Spanish army to hang around because they're afraid of it. Argentina, Venezuela first, then Cuba last, fearful of the slave resistance. And in 1820 through 1833, Simón Bolívar, who leads the independence movements there in northern South America, he's actually going to try to create a Gran Colombia. He wants to create a united South America. What he does do is, for a few years, unite the northern part of South America. But of course, it all breaks up. There may have been an idea that all these Latin American places would hang together, but they don't. They really don't. So Brazil. Now, earlier I said Brazil was different. They're different in a lot of ways. First of all, they're Portuguese. Second, their new government is a monarchy, a king, not a republic like the others, not a republic. And if you remember, the Portuguese king had actually fled to Rio. Now, he comes to Rio. Napoleon, you will remember, is defeated. He's out. He's gone by 1815. So you would think the Portuguese royal family would go back to Lisbon, right? Move back to Portugal. Do they? No, they stay on a while longer. They like Rio. Beautiful climate, nice weather, beautiful city. They're living the good life. But the Portuguese people, there's some mismanagement back in Portugal, and there's some uprising, and there's some rioting in Portugal, so the king has to go back. When he's leaving, he leaves his son, Dom Pedro, in charge. And he says to his son, he says, listen, this is 1820. A lot of places are already independent of the Spanish by this point. And he says to Dom Pedro, he says, if you see independence is coming, get out in front and declare it first so that we can stay in charge. Because the Creoles, it's not so much that they want to change society or even change the government. They just want to stop paying taxes to Portugal, and they just want to get rich and be independent themselves. So by 1825, the king has moved back. He's left his Dom Pedro to be in charge. And Dom Pedro does exactly what his dad said. When he sees independence is coming, he says, We are independent of Portugal. I now declare us a free nation, and I'm in charge. Okay, and the Creole don't fight it. They don't fight the monarchy thing. Um, and we already mentioned some of the things these new nations face. Should Catholicism be a national religion? What should they do? Should they free the slaves and be more egalitarian? Or should they focus on economic focus and using slaves to help with producing export products like sugar, crops like sugar, later coffee, rice, these kind of things? Should we concentrate on them and get rich? Also, what are we going to do with this whole color distinction? It had really gotten rolling back during the Spanish and Portuguese reigns. There were actually posters. I don't remember if I said this in the other article, posters with 40, 50 different racial groups on there, defined colors of how dark their skin was. It was crazy. It's crazy. So how do they do that? Well, basically what they're going to come down to is they're going to say, aristocrats run our country. We're republics, but aristocrats dominate those. We're going to have Catholicism. We're not going to be a theocracy, but we will retain our Catholicism. We will not free slaves. It will happen gradually over the next 60 years, but we're not going to do it. So political fragmentation. Well, as I told you initially, there's this idea that we can take all of Latin America and create a couple of different countries, big ones. Doesn't work. Why does it fail? Number one, there are geographic barriers. There's a lot of difference between Colombia and the coast of Brazil. There's great distances to travel. There are poor roads. There are regional, ethnic, linguistic differences. Yes, Spanish is the official language, but there are a lot of native languages spoken. Still, the mass of the population's outside the political process. What do I mean by that? For most of these people, it doesn't matter who's running the country. It doesn't matter how big our country is. My life stays the same. So I get real invested in this thing that doesn't impact me? Of course not. Of course not. I'm not going to busy myself with something that has no meaning for me. And it'll split into 18 South America into at least up through the some of Mesoamerica into at least 18 countries. All right. So one of the things that happens in 1820 is Latin America has kicked out the Spanish and the Portuguese. But maybe the Spanish and the Portuguese will come back. Maybe they'll try to come back once they get their act together to get themselves stabilized after all they've been through with the Napoleonic Wars. So what prevents them from recolonizing? The United States steps in and issues the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. What's the Monroe Doctrine say? It says that any country who gets involved in Latin America, it will be seen as a threat to U.S. security, and the United States will get involved. We will protect any of these Latin American countries against outside colonialism. In 1823, are we a powerful enough country to back this up? No. We're growing, but we're not there. We're not there. So who helps us? Well, as I've got there, it's the British who help us. The British come in and the British are like, no one's going to recolonize, because one of the things the British have been doing, and this had happened, they've been doing a lot of business in Latin America. Remember back during the Napoleonic Wars when they weren't paying attention to Europe? And we've got the philosophy of mercantilism. Mercantilism, you'll remember, is where the home country creates the manufactured or the finished products and sells them to the colonies. Colonies provide cheap raw material. You remember all that? Well, England's been, and this is the beginning of their industrial revolution, they've been making a lot of money selling their industrial goods or finished goods to these Latin American countries and buying raw materials off of them. So they don't want to go back to the old way. So they back up the United States. Eventually, we'll get strong enough we can do that. But is it 1820s? No. So there's an economic resurgence, see, in the later 1800s. And it's based in part on a philosophy of positivism. Positivism means through observation, through science, we can make the world, our country, our economy, our government a better place. Okay? And there's a second industrial revolution comes along in the late 1800s. Now, you say second industrial revolution. What do you mean? Well, there's the first industrial revolution, which occurs in England, later in Germany, France, and the United States. Emphasis is usually on clothing, steel, ironworking, those kind of things. The second industrial revolution comes along in the late 1800s, and that involves electricity, light bulbs, cars, internal combustion engine, eventually planes, a whole new set of things. And when this second industrial revolution comes along, there's a population growth associated with it, and there's thus demand for more food. Food production's getting better. So these countries become, in Latin America, become wealthy based off selling their agricultural products to Europe. And so people accept reforms. And I don't know if you can see it, but that basically the picture down here shows a man walking up to see the wise man in the cave. He sees the wise man in the cave and he asks, how does a person find happiness? And the wise man says, how would I know? I haven't read the latest research yet. So the idea being that things can get better. So let's see. That makes a pretty nice stopping spot. I've been going about 20 minutes, so I'll let you guys have a little break and I'll do part 2 later. Thank you.